I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen bee.
Queen Camilla expected a routine review of old royal holdings. What emerged from the private vault was anything but routine. Buried among sealed financial instructions connected to Prince Philip was a directive with one unmistakable beneficiary, Princess Anne. The money had not been left to the Crown, Charles, or any shared family structure. It had been privately assigned to Anne. And when Camilla understood exactly what the papers proved, her reaction transformed the room. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Camilla sat across from Charles as the authenticated file was read aloud. The private royal vault, a tightly controlled store of family papers, sealed correspondence, and personal financial instructions, separate from ceremonial crown property, had produced something undeniable. The file proved Philip had directed funds to Anne alone, giving his daughter sole beneficial control, instead of placing the money under the king, the queen, or the wider royal household. She stayed composed. Then her sister-in-law's name appeared again. The monarch lowered her eyes, removed her glasses, and said nothing. Charles barely moved. He did not challenge the wording. His silence cut deeper, because the monarch understood what the document meant. This was no accidental transfer. His father had made a deliberate choice. For Camilla, that realization carried private humiliation. The structure she now represented had been left outside Philip's plan, and the man beside her seemed to recognize it first. The second page made the discovery harder to absorb. Philip had included instructions preventing the fund from being absorbed into broader royal household accounts after his death. In plain terms, the money was meant to stay outside the machinery supporting the working monarchy. It would remain protected and under Anne's control. Camilla pushed the folder back across the table before finishing the page. The king placed one hand on it, but did not pull it closer. Neither spoke. Camilla finally broke the silence. "How long has this been sitting there?" An aide was instructed to contact Anne privately, but no answer came immediately. The princess had not been present for the discovery. Charles looked again at his father's instructions, something darker than shock behind his restraint. The question was no longer simply who received the money. It was why Philip had trusted his daughter enough to isolate it from everyone else. The inheritance stopped looking like a financial decision and began to feel like a judgment that morning. The money itself was only the first blow. Understanding why Philip chose Anne meant reopening a father-daughter bond forged long before Camilla ever stood at the center of royal power. Princess Anne had spent decades behaving as though inheritance meant very little to her. She rarely advertised sentiment, avoided theatrical displays of royal emotion, and built a reputation around duty rather than applause. Yet Philip had watched all of it. He had watched how she worked, how she handled pressure, and how rarely she asked for recognition. Now the vault suggested he had quietly made a judgment that no palace ceremony had ever announced. Anne took the private call alone and assumed someone had made an administrative mistake. The Princess Royal, a title given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had never built her identity around inheritance or rank. What mattered was duty, and Philip had understood that instinct because he shared it. Father and daughter valued discipline, practicality, competition, and blunt honesty. They could argue without ceremony, recover without apology, and speak in a way few others around them dared. Charles had never possessed that same ease with his father. The king respected Philip, but affection between them carried tension, expectation, and the pressure of two very different temperaments. That history mattered now because the vault file did more than move money. It appeared to measure character. When Anne was told the instructions had been authenticated, meaning checked and confirmed as genuine, she did not celebrate. She simply went quiet. Camilla found that silence unbearable. She had expected surprise, embarrassment, perhaps a protest, that the arrangement seemed personal. Instead, the Queen heard that Anne had asked only one question. Had Charles read everything? The monarch had. And one handwritten line pulled him back. Philip had written that the fund should remain with someone who understands stewardship rather than display. Stewardship meant holding something responsibly long-term, not treating it as a prize. Charles recognized the language immediately. His father spoke that way when money, property, or privilege became confused with status. The sentence did not feel like legal wording. It felt like Philip himself, compressed into a final judgment that the king could neither soften nor ignore. Anne's name beneath it made the message harder to escape. Anne ended the call and stayed seated for seconds. Then she crossed to a desk, opened an old drawer, and removed a handwritten note from Philip that she had never publicly discussed. She did not read it aloud. She only held it, quietly feeling grief arrive before any sense of inheritance. That reaction changed everything. If Anne was not surprised, perhaps Philip had warned her years earlier. And hidden behind their quiet bond was one moment the family could never completely forget. The night he decided she could be trusted with something others could not. Years before the vault was opened, a private family crisis had forced Prince Philip to make a judgment about loyalty. It happened after a tense Windsor financial briefing, when a proposed restructuring would have pulled several privately held family assets into a wider administrative system. Most people in the room treated it as paperwork. Anne did not. She challenged the idea directly, and what happened after that meeting became the private trigger for everything now exploding around Camilla. Philip left that meeting deeply irritated. The Windsor financial briefing, a closed discussion used to review private family money, property, and future management, had proposed combining several personal holdings under one central system. On paper, the change promised simplicity. To him, it carried danger. Private family assets were not the same as crown resources, which supported the monarchy as an institution, rather than belonging personally to one royal. He feared that future households, spouses, or changing administrations could eventually blur that line. Anne followed him afterward because she knew he had not been convinced. Princess Anne rarely softened difficult conversations, and this one was no different. She told her father that if the distinction mattered so much, he could not leave it to memory. Future generations would interpret silence however they wished. "Write down what you mean," she told him, making clear that loyalty sometimes required confrontation rather than obedience. Philip bristled at first. He heard challenge in her words and reminded his daughter that he understood his own affairs perfectly well. Anne did not retreat. She told him she was not questioning his judgment. She was protecting it from people who might one day claim they understood his intentions better than he did. The anger between them cooled. Something else replaced it: respect. That night became the turning point. Philip summoned his private secretary, the senior aide responsible for handling confidential correspondence and personal administrative matters, and requested the relevant financial papers. According to the documented account later preserved with the vault file, he began setting out instructions designed to prevent those assets from being pulled into any wider royal structure. Anne had forced the question. Her father answered it in ink. Charles discovered the most damaging detail decades later. The handwritten date attached to the instructions was the day after that confrontation. The king stared at it, because coincidence suddenly became impossible. His father had not simply favored Anne after years of reflection. Her warning had directly triggered the decision. Camilla understood the implication almost immediately. Philip had not merely rewarded his daughter. He had built a barrier around the money to protect it from future royal influence. And decades later, that old decision would place Anne and Camilla in the same room, with no sealed envelope left between them. The confrontation did not happen before a crowd. There were no cameras, no public statements, and no ceremonial smiles to hide behind. Camilla asked to see Anne privately. Charles knew about the meeting but did not attend. That absence mattered. For the first time since the vault discovery, the two women sat opposite each other with no institutional buffer, and one question dominated the room. What exactly did Philip believe he was protecting from the future? Camilla wanted an answer from Anne herself. The Queen had already read the financial file, but documents could not explain whether the princess had known about the arrangement before her father died. Anne agreed to the meeting and refused advisors or lawyers. That choice mattered because legal representatives could have turned a family wound into a formal dispute. She wanted none of that. To her, Philip's decision belonged first to memory, trust, and family. Camilla leaned forward and asked the question she had been carrying since the vault opened. Did Philip distrust her? Anne paused before answering. The princess refused to turn her father's decision into a personal attack against one woman. He had been thinking beyond individuals, she said, because private wealth could pass through changing households, marriages, and future generations. The Queen heard the explanation, but the pain did not disappear. Camilla pressed harder. She said the arrangement created the unmistakable appearance that one branch of the family had been trusted more than another. Anne's expression tightened. Appearances, she answered, had never interested Philip as much as control. Her father cared about who would protect an intention after the person who made it was no longer alive to defend it. Anne then disclosed something she had never discussed publicly, drawing from a private conversation she had recorded in her personal notes years earlier. Philip had once told her that certain family resources should remain with someone who would never confuse duty with personal status. The words struck Camilla immediately. They almost matched the handwritten notation found inside the vault file. Camilla understood what that meant. The phrase had not been invented later by lawyers. It had lived in Philip's thinking long before the document was discovered. She finally asked whether he had deliberately meant to keep the money away from her. Anne folded her hands and answered quietly. Her father intended the money to go exactly where he wrote that it should go. Anne did not apologize. Camilla did not forgive. Then the princess added one final detail. Another binding instruction remained inside the file, and Charles had not yet examined its full effect. That changed the argument completely. Neither woman truly controlled what happened next, because Philip had built the arrangement around a mechanism designed to survive even the wishes of the reigning king. Charles was king, but this was not crown money. That distinction changed everything. When the final pages of Philip's instruction were examined, the palace discovered a protection stronger than family expectation. The assets had been placed under a private structure that transferred control directly to Anne. Charles could recognize the decision, question it, even dislike its consequences. But he could not simply reverse it, because the funds had never belonged to the institution he now commanded. Charles read the clause twice before speaking. Crown assets are resources tied to the monarchy as an institution, while private property belongs personally to an individual royal, and can be directed through lawful private instructions. That difference stripped rank of its usual force. The king could command a household, approve official arrangements, and shape the institution around him, but he could not simply absorb Philip's personal holdings into royal control. The signatures, asset schedules, and succession mechanism all pointed in the same direction. Anne had been selected to take long-term responsibility. Charles kept reading as an advisor began explaining the legal structure. The monarch raised one hand before the explanation could continue. He understood. His father had not left behind a vague wish that could be interpreted differently later. Philip had created a binding arrangement. Camilla watched him closely, because she knew what that meant for her as well. The Queen could question the fairness of the outcome, but emotion had no power over wording this precise. Camilla finally asked whether anything could be reconsidered. Charles answered gently, yet there was no uncertainty in his voice. Reopening the arrangement would mean challenging Philip's express decision, and he would not do it. The king closed the file, removed his reading glasses, and told the room there would be no attempt to overturn his father's instructions. For her, that sentence carried a finality no royal title could soften. Anne's inheritance also proved more significant than a simple transfer of cash. The fund was tied to private investments and family holdings accumulated over time, some carrying personal history as well as financial value. She had also been given discretion over certain proceeds, allowing her to support descendants and defined family obligations while preserving the core assets. That authority changed the emotional balance immediately. Anne was no longer simply the beneficiary of Philip's decision. She was the steward he had deliberately chosen to protect it. Charles understood the responsibility. Camilla understood the power. And then Anne made her first decision. With one sentence, Charles had ended the argument over ownership. But he had also given his sister the freedom to decide what Philip's legacy would actually become. Anne did not celebrate. She did not expand her household, summon photographers, or treat Philip's decision as a victory over anyone. Instead, within hours of being formally briefed, she made a choice that stunned those expecting a family power struggle. Much of the fund would remain intact. Certain proceeds would be directed toward long-term family responsibilities and causes her father valued. The money would not become a trophy. It would become exactly what Philip intended, a responsibility. Anne accepted control without treating ownership as triumph. The princess instructed advisors to preserve the core holdings, keep detailed records, and avoid unnecessary public display. A custodian is someone who protects and manages something entrusted to them, and that was how she chose to see herself. The distinction mattered, because Philip had not merely handed over wealth, he had placed responsibility in her hands, and she seemed determined to prove that his trust had not been misplaced. Camilla received the decision with mixed emotions. The queen learned that Anne would not surrender control, but she also learned something unexpected. Her sister-in-law had no intention of using the inheritance to embarrass her. There would be no public victory, no quiet boasting, no attempt to turn Philip's choice into a weapon. That restraint unsettled her. For the first time, she wondered whether she had taken the vault discovery as a personal rejection when it may have been something more complicated. Charles went to see Anne privately soon afterward. The king admitted that Philip's handwriting had reopened memories he thought he had buried. His father had often expressed affection through expectation, discipline, and correction, rather than easy words. Seeing those familiar strokes on the page made him feel judged all over again. Anne listened, without interrupting, because she understood that pain better than anyone. Anne then reached for the old note she had taken from her drawer after the first call. She slid it across the table. The handwritten message contained no figures, no instructions, and no legal language. It simply thanked her for saying the difficult thing, when everyone else preferred the easy answer. Charles read the line twice, pressed his thumb against the edge of the paper, and remained silent. The meaning finally changed for him. Philip had not casually favored one child. Anne had earned his trust by challenging him when silence would have been easier. And suddenly, the old wound looked different. The inheritance had divided them when it first emerged, but those handwritten words now gave Charles one final choice: carry his hurt back to Camilla, or use what he had learned to stop the family conflict before it hardened permanently. Charles returned to Camilla without advisors, folders, or legal explanations. For once, there was nothing left for palace machinery to solve. He carried only the meaning he had finally taken from his father's note. Philip had not written a verdict against Camilla. He had chosen Anne because, at one decisive moment, she had challenged him to protect his own intentions. And now Charles faced a choice of his own: defend old wounds, or end the rivalry before it became permanent. Charles asked Camilla to speak with him alone. The king deliberately removed the aides who normally handled sensitive royal matters because he no longer wanted the dispute filtered through procedure. He explained the Windsor confrontation that had triggered Philip's decision years earlier, long before the current tension existed. The inheritance had not been created in response to today's family structure. It had grown from an old argument about control, memory, and whether private intentions could survive future generations. Camilla listened until she could no longer hide what the discovery had done to her. The Queen admitted that the vault file had made her feel like an outsider, being judged by a man who was no longer alive to explain himself. She had read Philip's restrictions as a message about her place in the family. The pain was not simply about money. It was about belonging, and whether she had ever been trusted inside the private world behind the crown. Charles answered with something he had avoided saying from the beginning. He had felt rejected too. The monarch confessed that seeing Anne named so clearly had revived an old fear that nothing he did had ever fully satisfied his father. Philip's expectations had shaped him for decades, and the handwriting in that file had reopened wounds no legal explanation could close. Camilla reached toward the folder beside him, then stopped. She did not open it. Instead, she asked Charles to tell her what his father had written in his own words. He repeated the line from Philip's private note, preserved by Anne. She had been thanked for saying the difficult thing when everyone else preferred the easy answer. That sentence changed the room. Camilla finally understood that the inheritance was not simply exclusion. It was trust earned through confrontation. Fighting it now would risk turning Philip's private wealth into the very thing he had feared, a weapon of status and competition. Camilla made her decision quietly. She would not challenge Anne again. When the family answered publicly, she would stand beside her. Their private understanding changed the atmosphere inside the palace. But outside its walls, the story had already escaped, and the public was about to give Philip's decision a meaning of its own. By morning, the vault revelation was no longer a private royal matter. It dominated breakfast broadcasts, newspaper stands, radio phone-ins, and crowds gathered near Windsor. Yet something surprising happened as the story spread. The public did not focus only on the value of the inheritance. People focused on the person Philip had chosen. Anne's decades of relentless duty suddenly became the lens through which the decision was understood. And one front page captured the mood more powerfully than any palace statement could. Camilla watched the coverage in silence, as Anne's photograph filled the screen. The Queen reached toward the remote, paused, then left the television on. Palace officials had already issued a restrained acknowledgement, explaining that the arrangement concerned private property, meaning assets personally owned, rather than money tied to constitutional succession or public royal funding. That distinction mattered because the story was not about who would inherit the crown. It was about whom Philip had trusted with something that belonged to him alone. Anne reacted very differently to the attention. The princess disliked seeing her father's private decision turned into a contest between siblings, and through a documented palace communication, she asked that no celebratory language be used around the inheritance. She did not want headlines declaring victory. She wanted the fund treated as responsibility. That request only strengthened the public image forming around her, because restraint now seemed to confirm the very qualities Philip had written about. Camilla felt the old sting return when broadcasters described Anne as the child her father trusted most. The monarch had promised Charles she would not challenge the arrangement, and she kept that promise. Still, comparison hurt. The same story that elevated her sister-in-law seemed to reopen every fear about belonging that she had confessed privately the night before. Then one broadcaster quoted the phrase, preserved in Philip's documented instruction, stewardship rather than display. Commentators seized on it. Stewardship, simply put, meant protecting something for the future, rather than using it for personal glory. Suddenly, the inheritance became larger than money. It became a public argument about how privilege should be carried. Outside Windsor Castle, crowds gathered as newspapers passed from hand to hand. One front page showed Anne beneath the words, "Philip's Final Trust." During a television interview, an elderly woman summed up the mood. He knew she would look after it, not show it off. But the newspapers had written only the public verdict. The family still needed its own. And when Camilla and Anne appeared together again, one deliberate gesture would finally decide whether this story ended in rivalry or reconciliation. The final moment was almost understated. Anne arrived expecting duty, not drama. Camilla was already there. Days earlier, the two women had sat opposite each other, divided by suspicion, wounded pride, and the shadow of a man who could no longer explain himself. Now there were no lawyers, and no vault papers between them. Camilla stepped toward Anne first. What she said did not change Philip's will, move a single pound, or alter ownership. It changed something harder, the meaning of the entire confrontation. Camilla had finally accepted what the documents could never explain on their own. The Queen told Anne privately that she had mistaken exclusion for insult, and that the discovery had shattered her because it revived an old fear of never being fully accepted inside Philip's private idea of family. A private instruction meant a personal direction over assets that belonged to him, not property controlled by the monarchy. Charles had already ordered that no challenge would be made. Anne listened without rushing to comfort her. The princess did not rewrite history or pretend her father had viewed everyone in the same way. She simply said that Philip's decision came from trust earned during one specific confrontation, not from a final ranking of who mattered most. Her father had needed someone who would protect his intention when pressure came. She had done that before, and he had believed she would do it again. Camilla finally understood the difference. The money had not been taken from her because it had never been hers to lose. Philip had placed an obligation on his daughter, and Anne had chosen to carry it without turning privilege into spectacle. The Queen briefly touched her arm and said, "Your father made his choice. I understand it now." She received only a small nod in return, but that was enough. Charles watched the two women move forward together. The king no longer saw his father's decision as proof that he had failed some final test. Instead, he understood what the inheritance had exposed. Rank could decide precedence. Titles could decide position. But trust had been earned in quieter, harder moments, when someone was willing to say what others avoided. Philip's private funds remained with Princess Anne exactly as he directed. Camilla did not overturn the decision. Charles did not challenge it. Anne did not exploit it. What began as humiliation ended in understanding, and what looked like a fortune became a responsibility. That was the real inheritance. Not money, not status, trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.